Chinese land writ large is only about 1/5 the productivity of the global average. So they have to put in scads more, in case of some fertilizers, 5 and 6 times as much to get the same amount of calories out. It's particularly bad with infrastructure. We are now in the early stages of the Chinese following the Japanese program of building roads to places where no one lives. And of course, we've all heard about the ghost cities. These are not the plans of a country that is planning 30, 40, 50 years down the line. These are the operations of a country that has one goal: make sure there's not an internal rebellion. Now, separate from the book, separate from the long-term situation, we've had a government collapse in China over the last year. Xi is now exiled or imprisoned or executed pretty much everyone in the country who is capable of independent thought. And so we're now getting these catastrophic countrywide policies because it's a cult of personality. Nobody wants to bring him in any information, but if he gives a speech on TV, they take that as their marching orders and they interpret that the way they think that the guy who kills the messenger wants it to be interpreted. So this is how you get places in Shanghai, like literally going out and disinfecting the runways. I'm just ridiculous policies from a health and a development point of view. And it's happening in electricity, it's happening in transport, it's happening in manufacturing. And so we even got Apple, like the quintessential American company that has outsourced its entire supply chain. Every time there's been a writing on the wall that there's a genocide or there's a crackdown in Hong Kong or there's inefficiency or labor costs are going, every single time that something has come up, the Apple has doubled down on China. So now 92%, I believe, of their supply chain is internal to China. And even they started looking last month at other options for the first time. Well, we didn't get our first policy to address it until April. So we've had rolling blackouts in the country that is supposedly the second largest economy and the manufacturing superpower, and they lasted for a year before we got a policy change. That does not tell me that there's an efficient state apparatus in place. From my point of view, it's as much economic as it is strategic. So under Obama was the first president we had had in 30 years that didn't negotiate a single free trade pact. Trump walked away from a number. He did renegotiate NAFTA, which honestly I thought was great because it redefined what the American economy is in the minds of the far right. So Mexico's now in the club, which is brilliant moving forward. Mexico has one of the healthiest demographies in the world. Let me put my personal cards on the table so you know where I'm coming from. I'm a bit of a globalist. I'm an Atlanticist. I see the rapid expansion of things like NAFTA and NATO to other countries as the most reliable way of ensuring American security and wealth for the long term. But people who believe my way have lost all 7 of the last presidential elections. So again, not an aberration, it's a trend. Isolation in the American system comes and goes more than it does with most countries, because for the United States, since we've broadly secured what we need here in North America, we always have the option of looking out and we always have the option of looking in. And so when we do see something that's an opportunity or a threat across the ocean, we will rise to the occasion and we will deal with it. Maybe not on a time frame that a lot of other countries would like, but we do. What was unique about the post-World War II environment was that for the first time in dealing with that threat, we found ourselves occupying territory because so many countries had fallen, and we felt the need that we had to make sure that Imperial Japan and Nazi Germany did not resuscitate themselves in a short period of time like Imperial Germany into Nazi Germany. That required boots on the ground, and that required something that we usually don't have in foreign policy in this country, a plan. And that plan was globalization, and it lasted for 70 years. It is the longest term bipartisan foreign policy we have ever had, but it achieved its goal 30 years ago. And so there was always going to be a need for, if not a withdrawal or a rejiggering, a redefinition. And the president who tried to get America to have that conversation with itself, what sort of world do we want to leave for the next generation? That was George Herbert Walker Bush, and we punished him for it. And so, we're a democracy. This is ultimately on us. Yeah. But then we elected a series of people who have decided that it was time to loosen the ties that bind between us and the rest of the world. And since globalization ultimately was a bribe, you let us write your security policies. In exchange, you can sell into our market and access anything else. That's a subsidy. And when you carry out a subsidy for 30 years, but you don't get the strategic benefit, people get annoyed. And so we got Obama and we got Trump, and now we have Biden. And if you look at what, say, Biden is doing with the Russians right now, part of me is thrilled that we're finally leading a coalition again. But you'll notice there's nothing economic about it. This is a fair weather friends coalition when we all have the same strategic goal. There is no guns for butter trade this time around. So as soon as this war is finished, that is probably the end of the coalition. That's a very different sort of engagement compared to what we've been used to since World War II. There's two ways you can run it. First, the reason why the Russians are doing this. The Russians have been invaded 50 odd times in their history. And so they see the only way to defend themselves to get a forward military position in the places where those invasions have flowed through. So the Polish Gap, the Bessarabian Gap, those are the two that are in play with the Ukrainians. Ukraine, unfortunately, is just unlucky enough to not be in those gaps, but on the way to the gaps. So it's not that Russia won't stop until it has all of Ukraine. It's that Russia won't stop when it has all of Ukraine. And for the Russians, by their own definition, to feel secure, they have to occupy all or part of about 25 different countries that collectively have twice the population of their own. So that was never going to fly for any number of reasons for any number of countries. There is no deal where you can give them an inch and expect them to be happy, because this is the eighth conflict they've triggered since Putin came in. It will not be the last. So there's something to be said for ending it earlier rather than later. We have learned that lesson repeatedly in American history, whether it was with the British Empire, with the Confederacy, with the Mexicans, with the Canadians, with the Germans, with the Japanese. It's every war we come to late, and then we end up suffering more because of it. One of the great achievements of the post-Cold War era is that we drew a line and we stuck to it. And it was the only era in our history where we actually didn't have to fight the actual war. So that was kind of a nice perk. Well, there's two problems. Number one, there's a lot of equipment that we could theoretically give the Ukrainians that they've never seen before. So there's a training time frame.
Yeah.
And we are bringing some Ukrainian soldiers out of Ukraine for that training. So that's a pipeline, though. That's not a sudden surge. Yeah. For the stuff that you can suddenly surge, you need things that they know how to use or can use with a minimum of training. The problem we have, the complication that is looming over all of this, is that failed run at Kiev from the third day of the war, that giant convoy. It stalled in a day because they ran out of fuel, and then everyone had to walk back to Belarus on the third day because they ran out of food. And, at one point, everyone in the military was like, this is great. The Russians don't know how to fight a war. And then after they thought
about it. That was my reaction.
Yeah, exactly. Holy crap, the Russians don't know how to fight a war. And they see this as an existential battle for their survival. So we know that if NATO forces come up against Russian forces directly, they can either have a screaming retreat and contemplate the death of their country over the next 20 years, or they can escalate, and they probably would. So it is critical to keep this war bottled up in Ukraine, and it is critical to kill the Russian military here now so that they can never do this again. Secretary Austin was absolutely right with that. The trick is, how do you do that with a force that has insufficient equipment, insufficient training, and poor logistics? There is no good solution here. And any weapon system that would really turn the tide, like, for example, the US would not be engaged with the Russians in an artillery duel. We would use airstrikes. But we can't give the Ukrainians our jets because they would require American pilots and service crews. And if you have that, then you have an American military presence in Ukraine, and you can get that direct clash that we have to avoid. Right. So the weapon systems that could win this for them, they can't have because they can't use them. And that leaves us with this netherworld in between. And it's just not clear how much of the former Soviet satellites that are now NATO allies, how much equipment they have that they can even give the Ukrainians, even if we replace everything in Czech Republic and Poland with F-16s and M1 Abrams immediately. There's a limit, and we're probably going to hit that limit this year. And that counts for us too. We're running out of Stingers and Javelins.